On the 6th of May, 1910, King Edward VII lay dying at Buckingham Palace. His wife, Queen Alexandra, was at his side. And then, with Alexandra's reluctant permission, the exact circumstances of which historians still debate, the dying king's mistress of 12 years, Alice Keppel, was brought into the room to say goodbye. She was his favorite. Alexandra knew it. The nation knew it. And Alice left that room carrying a family story that would, 113 years later, see her own great-granddaughter crowned Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The 6th of May. Both times. 2 women were in that room at the end of Edward VII's life. The official wife, composed. The beloved mistress, falling apart. The one who walked out in grief and social exile set in motion something her own children would preserve, her grandchildren would maintain, and her great-granddaughter would crown. What followed wasn't a literal 100-year plan. No letter survives instructing each generation exactly what to do. What was transmitted instead was a social identity, a way of being useful to a particular institution on that institution's own terms. And what is remarkable is how consistently it reproduced itself across 4 generations without anyone apparently forcing it to. The Keppel women, across those 4 generations, maintained a recognizable social position, the discreet, pragmatic, indispensable alternative to the official royal wife. It worked in 1898. It was still the operational model in 1971. It produced a wedding in 2005, and in 2023, it was crowned. To understand how it ends, you need to understand what Alice actually built, and how deliberately she built it. Alice Frederica Edmonstone was born on April 29, 1868, in Woolwich, Kent, the youngest of 9 children. Her father was Sir William Edmonstone, 4th Baronet, a retired admiral then serving as superintendent of Woolwich Dockyard. The family seat was Duntreath Castle in Stirlingshire, Scotland, held by the Edmonstone baronets since 1425, when King Robert III of Scotland gave it to his daughter Mary Stuart as a wedding gift. Ancient lineage, real title, real castle. 9 children on a baronet's income. That financial constraint is the engine of everything that follows. The British aristocracy of the 1870s and 1880s ran on 2 currencies simultaneously: social access and money. The Edmonstones had the first and were running short of the second. That combination produces a particular kind of intelligence. You learn early that position isn't self-sustaining. You learn that relationships are assets requiring active maintenance. You learn the art of being genuinely useful to people who have resources you need. And you learn that useful is a more durable quality than charming. Contemporary descriptions of Alice emphasize intelligence, wit, political awareness, and what one period account calls an interest in money that went beyond what was considered genteel for women of her class. She smoked cigarettes and read about politics at a time when women of her station weren't expected to do either visibly. Her elder daughter Violet later wrote that she had a gift of happiness and excelled in making others happy. She resembled a Christmas tree laden with presents for everyone. This is flattering and probably accurate, and also somewhat misleading about what was actually driving the machine. The writer, Sir Harold Acton, measured her more precisely. None could compete with her glamour as a hostess. She could have impersonated Britannia in a tableau vivant and done that lady credit. Biographer Jane Ridley, in Bertie, A Life of Edward VII, is most direct of all. Alice Keppel was, Ridley argues, the most political and manipulative of Edward's entire circle. Political, manipulative. Not words Ridley uses carelessly, and they are doing important work in distinguishing Alice from the standard account of what a royal mistress was. Before the king arrived in her life, Alice had affairs with wealthier men than her husband. Ernest Becket, 2nd Baron Grimthorpe, and Humphrey Sturt, 2nd Baron Allington. She was developing and refining a specific capability: how to read what a powerful man actually needs that he can't ask for officially, how to provide it without making either party uncomfortable, and how to manage a situation that involves a husband, a patron, and a structured arrangement that serves everyone's interests, while officially not existing. She married the Honorable George Keppel on June 1st, 1891, at the age of 23. George was the third son of William Coutts Keppel, 7th Earl of Albemarle, a family whose lineage traced to Arnold Joost van Keppel, the Dutch nobleman who had arrived in England with King William III in 1688 and been granted the earldom in 1696. 2 centuries of service to the British Crown ran through the Keppel name. As a younger son, George had the name, the connections, and, essentially, no money. He was serving as an army officer at the time of their marriage. Christopher Hibbert noted that he raised no objection to the prince's friendship with his wife. He reportedly said of Alice, "I don't mind what she does, as long as she comes back to me in the end." The arrangement was encoded into the marriage from the beginning. One biography of Alice notes, "Almost from the day she married the Honorable George Keppel in 1891, she knew that she..." and the surviving excerpt cuts off there. The sentence's shape is legible enough. The marriage was a platform, not a destination. She had 2 daughters, Violet, born in June 1894, and Sonia, born in May 1900. In 1898, the Prince of Wales came into range. She was 29. He was 56. By February of that year, he had begun openly visiting her at the Keppel home at 30 Portman Square. George left whenever Edward called. Edward Albert, Prince of Wales, known throughout his family as Bertie, had spent 57 years waiting to be king. Queen Victoria had kept him excluded from any meaningful governmental responsibility for his entire adult life. He had spent 4 decades as the social center of the British establishment, without any corresponding formal power, hosting vast gatherings, forging personal relationships with prime ministers and foreign monarchs, absorbing political intelligence from every available source, and having no constitutional mechanism to act on any of it. He ate heavily, drank freely, and had maintained a succession of female companions whose management had generated several public difficulties. The previous occupant of the position Alice was about to take, Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, had performed the role in a way that illuminated, with painful precision, everything it shouldn't be. She was dubbed the Babbling Brook, a play on her title as Lady Brooke before she became Countess of Warwick, and the nickname was accurate. She talked. She showed off her proximity to the Prince of Wales. She was publicly flamboyant about the arrangement in ways that embarrassed Edward, alienated Alexandra, and made the entire situation unnecessarily visible to people who had no need to see it. In Edwardian terms, she was indiscreet, the cardinal sin of that particular social universe. Queen Alexandra disliked her specifically for this failing. Millicent Levison Gower, Duchess of Sutherland, Daisy's own half-sister, was overheard to observe that Edward was a much pleasanter child since he changed mistresses. Even his previous mistress's relatives preferred Alice. Alice studied the problem of Daisy Greville and solved it systematically. The contrast she offered wasn't incidental, it was designed. Where Daisy performed her access, Alice treated it as strictly confidential. Where Daisy publicly positioned herself as the power behind the throne, Alice declined any such characterization. Where Daisy had divided the court, Alice united it. Alexandra not only tolerated Alice, but actively preferred her, which is documented across multiple independent sources and is the most striking single fact about Alice's social management. The wife of a king ended up preferring the woman her husband loved because that woman had made herself genuinely useful to the court rather than merely to the king. Alexandra found Alice's company genuinely pleasant. This matters. A tolerated rival and a socially preferred rival are very different things. And what Alice had achieved, by being discreet, by never flaunting her access, by managing everyone's dignity simultaneously, was to make herself a net positive for the institution, rather than a problem the institution had to absorb. After Edward acceded to the throne in January 1901, Alice's position formalized without ever becoming official. Multiple biographers, drawing on the French terminology of European court history, applied the term maîtresse en titre to her, the monarch's official mistress, institutionalized and acknowledged by those who needed to know, officially invisible to those who didn't. The term has a history. Madame de Pompadour held the equivalent position at the court of Louis XV, Madame du Barry after her. These were women who functioned as social anchors for the court, political intermediaries for the monarch, and managers of the informal relationships through which official power actually operated. Alice Keppel was the last significant holder of the role in British royal history. What she actually did for Edward is documented with specific, named evidence. Jane Ridley records that Edward seated Alice next to his most important guests at dinner because of her brilliance. She knew how to present a topic so that he would listen. She knew what not to say and when not to say it. And this negative knowledge was as valuable as the positive kind. Biographer Raymond Lamont Brown describes the political mechanism precisely. He completely trusted Alice, and through her, he could make his political opinion known. A message to Alice was enough to get an arguable topic dropped into conversation to gauge effect, which was reported back to the king. A message to Alice was enough. She was the test instrument, the political soundboard, the back channel through which a constitutional monarch who couldn't speak directly on contested political matters could nonetheless speak on contested political matters, with full deniability on both sides. The evidence for this function is specific and named. The Viceroy of India, in a statement preserved in Alice's biography, said, "There were 1 or 2 occasions when the king was in disagreement with the Foreign Office, and I was able, through her, to advise the king with a view to the foreign policy of the government being accepted." She was very loyal to the king, and patriotic at the same time. The Viceroy of India used the royal mistress to bring a recalcitrant sovereign into alignment with his own government's foreign policy. This is statecraft, conducted through a woman with no office, no portfolio, and no constitutional standing. Prime Minister H. Asquith and his wife Margot once wrote Alice a letter thanking her for her wise counsel. The sitting Prime Minister of the United Kingdom thanked a woman with no title for her guidance on matters of governance. Alice was later annoyed when Margot Asquith published a memoir in 1933 that mentioned this explicitly, not because the account was inaccurate, but because it named what she had spent years keeping unnamed. She disliked any mention of her political involvement with the king being made in public, as the Wikipedia account of Alice's career records. Discretion wasn't personal style. It was the operational requirement. The moment you name the arrangement, you destroy the arrangement. She demonstrated this understanding even in the most intimate management decisions. Concerned about the king's declining health around 1905, she wrote a private letter to the Portuguese minister Marquis de Sovaral. "I want you to try and get the king to see a proper doctor about his knee. Do what you can with your famous tact, and, of course, don't tell anyone I wrote to you. Don't tell anyone I wrote to you." She was managing the king's health through a third party, maintaining her own invisibility even in acts of care. The financial infrastructure was maintained through Edward's private network. He gave Alice shares in a rubber company. Those shares later yielded her a sum worth about $7 million in today's money. His own bankers managed her investments. Sir Ernest Cassell, Edward VII's principal financial advisor, who traveled with the royal circle to Biarritz and Paris and is confirmed in multiple sources as present during royal visits, was part of the network that kept Alice financially secure. King Edward VII let his own bankers and financial advisors manage her businesses, as one account records. He secured a well-paid position for George through Sir Thomas Lipton. Christopher Hibbert records that George cheerfully went to work for Sir Thomas Lipton, who obligingly found him employment at the prince's instigation. George had no financial incentive to disturb the arrangement. He didn't. Alice also found her brother, Sir Archibald Edmonstone, a position in the royal household. He served as groom-in-waiting for the final 3 years of Edward VII's reign. She was building a structure, not just an affair. Everyone who participated had a reason to protect it. This was the model. A woman who solved political problems that had no official solution, sustained through a compliant husband, financially maintained through invisible architecture, protected by absolute discretion. The maîtresse en titre in full operation. It worked for 12 years, and it worked completely. And when it ended not because it had failed, but because the king died. Let's return to the room at Buckingham Palace on 6th of May 1910. Edward had returned from France on 27th of April, suffering from severe bronchitis. He had been unwell since the spring. Those around him who paid attention to such things had been watching with concern since at least the Biarritz visit. Alexandra came back from Corfu on May 5th, cutting short a visit to her brother King George I of Greece. By the morning of May 6th, the situation was critical. Through that day, Edward suffered several heart attacks. He refused to go to bed. "No, I shall not give in. I shall go on. I shall work to the end." His son, shortly to become King George V, came to sit with him between episodes of faintness and told him his horse, Witch of the Air, had won a race at Kempton Park that afternoon. The room was quiet. The king was struggling to stay upright in a chair. The son said, "Your horse won today." The king replied, "Yes, I have heard of it. I am very glad." Those were his final words. At 11:30 p.m., he lost consciousness for the last time. He was carried to bed. He died 15 minutes later. Alice Keppel was in the palace that evening, and she was admitted to the room. The version of this scene that entered popular history holds that Alexandra graciously extended an invitation to her husband's mistress as an act of statesmanlike generosity, documented in various accounts by the attending court physician. Sir Francis Laking was indeed Edward VII's confirmed personal physician. His presence is verified across multiple independent records. What can be said of the deathbed accounts attributed to him is more careful. Sources refer to the eminent royal doctor who was in attendance, without always naming him explicitly. And the specific claim that Alexandra extended a gracious invitation has been directly challenged by careful historical analysis as a myth that was written in history books as fact. What actually happened is almost certainly this. Years earlier, during his 1902 appendix operation, Edward had written Alice a letter, expressing the hope that if he were dying, those about him would permit her to visit. Alice kept that letter. When the end came in May 1910, she produced it. Alexandra, confronted with her husband's own written wish, allowed Alice in while Edward was still conscious. The word reluctantly appears in multiple accounts of Alexandra's decision. Once in the room, Alice sat beside the king at his beckoning. What happened next is permanently unresolved. The attending physician recorded that Edward, in some form, asked the two women to make their peace, that he insisted on some gesture of acknowledgement between his wife and his mistress. Alexandra later denied this occurred. 2 witnesses, 2 conflicting accounts, 1 dead and 1 with every reason to remember the evening differently. What no one disputes is how it ended. When Edward lost consciousness, Alexandra turned to the physician and said, "Get that woman away." 5 words. The compressed verdict of a marriage and a compromise, and 12 years of diplomatic restraint. Alexandra had been gracious about the arrangement for more than a decade. Genuinely gracious, not merely resigned, since she had actively preferred Alice to Daisy Warwick and treated her with courtesy throughout. The grace was real. It was also conditional. The condition was, while he is alive. When the king was gone, Alice Keppel's access to this room, to this court, to this family, was gone with him. Alexandra's composure through that night was unbroken. She would sit with the king's body for 8 days, refusing to allow it to be moved, admitting small groups of visitors to the room. She made him hers again in death, in a way he had never quite been in life. Alice, the most controlled woman in the Edwardian social order. The woman whose entire professional value had been constructed on the absolute quality of her self-possession, who had managed a diplomatic back-channel between a monarch and his foreign office for 12 years, who had kept the secrets of a king and been trusted with his every letter, fell apart completely. She was so grief-stricken she had to be physically escorted from the room by members of the royal household. She screamed. She couldn't compose herself. She later tried to minimize what had happened. She admitted, eventually, that she had been unable to control herself. She attended the state funeral on May 20th, the procession that drew an estimated 3 to 5 million people to the streets of London, flanked by 35,000 soldiers, with 9 sovereigns riding in the cortege. Barbara Tuchman later described it as the last great gathering of the old world in its last certain summer. Alice watched from a side entrance. She and George left England that November. She maintained what the family called approximately 2 years of discretion before re-establishing their social presence in Britain. She was managing the aftermath as she had managed everything else, with patience, with an eye on the long-term position of the family, and with the understanding that the institution that had excluded her could be re-entered if she gave it no principled reason to keep her out. The family was always the thing she was building, always had been. Sonia Rosemary Keppel was born on 24th May 1900, the younger of Alice's 2 daughters. She and her older sister Violet knew King Edward VII as Kingy, that domestication of the most powerful man in the British Empire, the child's easy familiarity with a figure the rest of the country addressed with formal ceremony, tells you exactly how Alice had shaped the household. The king was a warm presence, a friendly adult who visited their home, someone the children knew. The arrangement's actual nature was understood in outline and left unspecified in detail. Alice was managing the information environment as precisely as she managed everything else. The popular claim that Sonia was Edward VII's biological daughter, that Camilla therefore carries the king's blood in 2 directions, and that the 2023 coronation completes a biological symmetry as well as a social one, does not survive contact with the evidence. The most careful historical analysis is direct on this. Sonia was born roughly 2 years after the affair began in 1898, and there is no contemporary whisper, no family rumor, no documented claim from anyone who knew the Keppels that she was half royal. The paternity rumors that did circulate in this family attached to Violet, the older daughter. Violet herself claimed in later life that Edward VII was her father, adopting the private signature Fitz-Edward, a claim most biographers regard as chronologically implausible. For Sonia, nothing rises above retrospective popular speculation. It's a question that has been asked. It has no answer behind it. What Sonia genuinely inherited was more durable. Social position. A family name with specific resonance in the aristocratic world, and the implicit knowledge of what her mother had built. In 1958, she published Edwardian Daughter, published by Hamish Hamilton in London, dedicated to her daughter Rosalind. Kirkus Reviews described it as the account of an English high society childhood written by the daughter of the famous Edwardian beauty. The king appears in it as kingy, warm, domestic, safely oblique. The machinery of what Alice had built, and at what cost, and through what precise mechanisms, does not appear. Sonia performed the same discretion her mother had practiced. She named the surface and left the structure to those who already understood it. On the 16th of November, 1920, Sonia married Roland Calvert Cubitt at the Guards' Chapel of Wellington Barracks in London. Roland was the fourth of 6 sons of Henry Cubitt, 2nd Baron Ashcombe, and the heir to the Ashcombe barony and to a fortune built by his great-grandfather, the Victorian builder Thomas Cubitt, who had done much of the construction work on Belgravia and Pimlico. All 3 of Roland's older brothers had been killed in the First World War. He was also heir to a fortune established by his great-grandfather, as Giles Brandreth's research on the Keppel family records. Sonia, like her mother before her, had married for the family's long-term stability as much as for any other reason. Their eldest child, Rosalind Maud Cubitt, was born on the 11th of August, 1921. Rosalind Maud Cubitt was Alice Keppel's granddaughter and Camilla's mother, and she occupies the least celebrated position in this story, which is precisely why she is so important. Alice had her managed crisis, and her managed exile, and her managed return. Camilla would have her own. Rosalind's work was the unglamorous one. Hold position through the decades when the family's location on the social board produced nothing visible. She married Major Bruce Shand of the 12th Royal Lancers, cavalry regiment, old military family, embedded in the upper-class military aristocratic world that ran through the English countryside and overlapped with the aristocratic circles Alice had inhabited. She is described in records as a British aristocrat and charity volunteer. She raised 3 children: Camilla, born July 17, 1947, Annabelle, born 1949, Mark, born 1951, in a family that knew its own identity. The direct evidence for what Rosalind transmitted, and how deliberately, is thin in available records. No letter, no diary entry, no contemporary account documents a conversation in which she explicitly positioned the Keppel story as an inheritance Camilla should carry forward. What can be said is that the family maintained social proximity to the circles that mattered, that Sonia's memoir was published when Camilla was 11 and was dedicated to Camilla's mother, and that the Keppel name carried a specific meaning in the world these women moved through. When Camilla was old enough to understand what Alice had been, the story was available. Whether it arrived as instruction or as the atmosphere of a particular kind of English family is a question the record does not resolve. Rosalind died on July 14, 1994, 1 year after the Camillagate tape had been published across 3 continents. She didn't live to see how it resolved. At the time of her death, permanent disgrace was still a plausible outcome. The family had endured worse. Alice had been escorted from a deathbed and used a side entrance at a state funeral and come back. You endure, and you wait, and you trust that patience remains the correct move. In 1971, Camilla Shand was 23 and had been in an intermittent relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles since 1966. She was introduced to Prince Charles by Lucia Santa Cruz, a Chilean diplomat's daughter who had been Charles's girlfriend at Cambridge. The introduction is most commonly placed at a polo match at Windsor Great Park, Smith's Lawn, though one biography specifically places it at Santa Cruz's flat instead. The polo version is the majority account across authoritative royal biographies, What Santa Cruz said as she made the introduction is recorded in Penny Junor's 2018 biography, The Duchess. Now you two be very careful. You got genetic antecedents. The first words spoken at the first meeting of Charles and Camilla were a reference to Alice Keppel and Edward VII. The connection wasn't something they discovered together over the course of a relationship. It was named at the first moment by a third party. Whether either of them needed the reminder is doubtful. Given the circles they moved in, the family story was almost certainly already known to both. But Santa Cruz made it explicit, and explicit is different from merely known. According to Giles Brandreth's Charles and Camilla, Portrait of a Love Affair, and this comes from one source, which is the appropriate caveat. Camilla responded to this genealogical opening with a line announcing the lineage, establishing the precedent, and making a proposal all at once, with enough nerve and lightness that it reads as wit rather than strategy. All circulating versions of this line trace back to Brandreth's 2005 book. No corroborating source for the exact wording has been identified independently. With that clearly stated, the character the line captures is accurate to what we know of the meeting. It converts what could have been an awkward historical fact into a flirtatious opening gambit, deploying your heritage before anyone can use it against you, with sufficient ease that it reads as confidence. That is precisely the Alice Keppel move. The mutual attraction was immediate and is documented across multiple independent sources. By 1972, they were spending weekends at Broadlands, the Hampshire estate of Lord Mountbatten, Charles's great-uncle, who actively encouraged the relationship. The complication was Andrew Parker Bowles. Camilla still had significant unresolved feelings for him, and the geometry remained tangled throughout 1972. In 1973, Charles departed on a 6-month tour with the Royal Navy. 1 month into his absence, Camilla announced her engagement to Andrew. They were married in July 1973 at the Guards' Chapel of Wellington Barracks, the same chapel where Sonia Keppel had married Roland Cubitt 53 years earlier. Charles attended the wedding. First move. Both parties married to other people. The board had reset, but neither had left it. Between 1973 and 2023, 50 years elapsed. What happened during those 50 years is the proof of the argument. Through the late 1970s to early 1980s, the exact date is genuinely disputed across biographies, ranging from 1978 to 1986, depending on which authorized source you follow. So, circa late 1970s to early 1980s is the safest formulation. Charles and Camilla resumed their relationship. Giles Brandreth drew the structural echo explicitly in his book. Andrew Parker Bowles accepted his wife's affair with Prince Charles, much as George Keppel, a professional soldier, accepted his wife's relationship with Edward VII. The compliant husband model had reproduced, in the same social class, in the same institutional context, a generation later. The pattern was running again. In 1981, Charles married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral. 2,500 guests, 750 million television viewers. Camilla Parker Bowles sat in the congregation. The marriage was, as Diana herself later put it, a bit crowded. In 1989, Diana confronted Camilla directly at a birthday party. According to Andrew Morton's 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, Diana recalled telling her, "I know what's going on between you and Charles, and I just want you to know that." Diana described the confrontation as one of the bravest moments of my entire 10 years of marriage. The affair was an open secret across the aristocratic and royal circles that overlapped on both sides of the equation. In June 1992, Morton published Diana, Her True Story, with Diana herself as the principal source through recorded interviews passed through an intermediary. The book named Camilla explicitly and detailed the affair. Charles and Diana separated formally in December 1992. In January 1993, a recording of an intimate telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, made in 1989, was published first in an Australian newspaper, then in Germany, then across the British tabloids. The coverage was international, the content humiliating. Camilla-gate entered the vocabulary of that decade and didn't leave it. In 1994, Charles admitted the affair in a television interview with Jonathan Dimbleby. When asked whether he had been faithful during his marriage, he said yes, then paused, then said, "Until it became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried." In 1995, Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles divorced. In 1996, Charles and Diana divorced officially. On 31st of August 1997, Diana died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. Camilla's public approval rating in the immediate aftermath was approximately 8%. Alice Keppel had been escorted weeping from a deathbed and forced into a side entrance at a state funeral. She had come back because she gave the institution no reason to permanently exclude her. The family's transmitted knowledge, explicit or atmospheric, documented or absorbed, pointed in one direction: patience. The rehabilitation took 26 years, and it wasn't passive. Camilla appeared incrementally in Charles's public world, one carefully managed step at a time. She took on charitable work with consistency and commitment, most visibly with the National Osteoporosis Society, the disease that had killed both her grandmother Sonia and her mother Rosalind. She became patron of the charity in 1997 and its president in 2001. The cause was genuine, and the public association built something the tabloids couldn't easily attack: a record of quiet, sustained, demonstrable usefulness. In 1999, she and Charles made their first public joint appearance, leaving a birthday party for her sister Annabelle at the Ritz Hotel in London. They didn't arrive together. The management of the visible moment was precise. Cameras caught them leaving together, but the arrival had been separate, the optics controlled. The public reaction was measured, not warm, but measured. The ice had broken without breaking anyone. In 2002, Camilla attended the Queen Mother's funeral with Charles. Royal funerals operate on explicit protocols of access and seating. Her presence there required family endorsement. She sat with the family. In 2003, she moved into Clarence House with Charles. On February 10, 2005, Clarence House issued the formal announcement: "It's with great pleasure that the marriage of HRH, the Prince of Wales, and Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles is announced." The statement included a specific and notable clause: if Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort, not Queen. The word Queen was a deliberate exclusion, not an oversight. The institution was managing expectations, and the expectation being managed was that the highest title remained unavailable. They married on 9th April 2005 at Windsor Guildhall in a civil ceremony. The Queen didn't attend the ceremony itself, but hosted a reception at Windsor Castle afterward. Camilla received the title Duchess of Cornwall. Then came 17 years of quiet. Overseas tours, charitable appearances, state occasions at which she stood beside Charles, reliably present and reliably self-effacing, accumulating what the British establishment eventually recognizes as reliability. Approval ratings moved upward, not dramatically, but steadily, from 8% toward the mid-20s, then mid-30s, then above 40%. Each year without scandal, each tour without incident, each public engagement completed and filed and noted was a deposit in an account that was slowly changing the institution's calculus. On the 6th of February, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II released a statement on the occasion of her Platinum Jubilee. The crucial passage read, It's my sincere wish that, when that time comes, Camilla will be known as Queen Consort, as she continues her own loyal service. The title Clarence House had specifically excluded in 2005 was now being confirmed by Elizabeth herself, publicly, in a formal statement, in the language of personal wish. 17 years from Princess Consort if ever to Queen Consort as I sincerely wish. Elizabeth had watched Camilla work for 17 years across more than 200 official engagements, 7 Commonwealth tours, and the entire slow arc of post-Diana public rehabilitation. And she had drawn her conclusion. Elizabeth died on the 8th of September 2022. Charles became king. Camilla became Queen Consort. Her approval rating at the coronation stood at approximately 52%. 26 years to go from 8% to majority acceptance. That isn't popularity. That is patience, institutionalized. On 6th May 2023, Camilla, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, walked into Westminster Abbey for the coronation of King Charles III. She wore a robe of regal purple velvet, trimmed with miniver. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed a crown on her head. Edward VII died on the 6th of May 1910, exactly 113 years earlier, the same calendar date. No public statement from the palace has acknowledged this coincidence. Whether it was noticed and left unremarked, or simply unnoticed in the logistics of a coronation, can't be determined from outside. The calendar produced this alignment without anyone appearing to engineer it, and it's precisely the kind of symmetry a story like this deserves. Alice Keppel died in Florence on the 11th of September 1947, aged 79, at Villa del Ombrellino. George died 2.5 months later, at the Ritz Hotel in London, in the permanent suite he kept there, having been married to Alice for 56 years. The same year Alice died, a girl was born to the Shand family in London, Camilla Rosemary Shand, in July 1947, sharing the earth with her great-grandmother for a few months that neither of them was old enough to remember. In her later years, Alice had hosted Winston Churchill and the exiled King and Queen of Greece and the King and Queen of Yugoslavia at the villa above Florence. When Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, Alice, dining at the Ritz Hotel, was heard to say, "Things were done much better in my day." She hadn't become sentimental about the institution. She had outlasted its worst episode and remained at the Ritz, making the observation. This is precisely what Alice Keppel sounded like. She didn't know that the girl born that same year would walk into Westminster Abbey 76 years later wearing a crown. She couldn't have known. But what she would have understood about that outcome isn't the sentimental version of this story. Alice was the most political and manipulative of her circle, and she knew the difference between sentiment and strategy. She would have understood that the institution rewards those who are useful to it on its own terms, without ever demanding official acknowledgement, without making the institution's acceptance a condition of continued service. She had been the indispensable confidant of a king for 12 years, and had never once insisted that indispensability be publicly named. She was escorted from his deathbed and used a side entrance at his state funeral, and she came back, because the work had been excellent and the discretion total, and the institution had no principled basis for permanently excluding someone who had behaved so well. 3 generations later, her great-granddaughter demonstrated the same understanding at considerably greater personal cost, over a much longer timeline, and arrived at the same destination. Sonia filed the story in a memoir dedicated to her daughter, with the machinery visible only in the silences. Rosalind held the social position through the decades when it produced nothing obvious, and Camilla, introduced to the Prince of Wales with an explicit reference to Alice Keppel in the opening sentence of the first conversation, spent 52 years understanding that the endgame wasn't to win the argument, but to outlast it. 4 women, 4 generations, 1 consistent identity. The discreet, pragmatic, indispensable alternative to the official wife. It worked in 1898. It was still the operational model in 1971. It produced a wedding in 2005. And on 6th May 2023, exactly 113 years after Alice Keppel was escorted, grief-stricken, out of a dying king's bedroom, it was crowned. You don't have to be the wife. You just have to outlast her. Subscribe for more stories like this.